General George C. Marshall, General H.H. Arnold, Chief of the Air Forces, and Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King attend the meeting. General A.I. Antonov, Red Army Chief of Staff, and Soviet officers meet with the Americans. On 8th August, 1 week after the conference ended, Russia declared war on Japan and sent her Siberian armies into Manchuria.
The Soviet attack on Manchuria may be one of the least well-known episodes of the Second World War, but the offensive provides us with a brilliant example of how to unleash an overwhelming invasion force with brilliant organization, planning, and execution. All through the summer of 1945, men and material was relocated from Europe to the Far East as part of the preparation. No fewer than 136,000 railway wagons were used, as victorious Soviet forces from the west journeyed up to 12,000 kilometers to take up positions in the east. By early August, 1.6 million men were ready to take part in the Manchuria attack, along with 5,500 tanks and no fewer than 28,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers. In overall charge of this Far East Command, Marshal Alexander Vasylyevsky, former chief of the Soviet General Staff and mastermind of the Stalingrad offensive. Now, in August 1945, this gifted soldier found himself preparing for another huge engagement in a very different theatre. Vasylyevsky's objective can be easily understood. His task was to drive the occupying Japanese out of Manchuria. He knew that this would hasten the end of the war against Japan, and success would bring about a massive increase in the Soviet Union's regional influence after hostilities were over. To achieve his task, the Commander-in-Chief conceived a plan that was both simple and bold. A simultaneous attack from all sides, involving an enormous display of military muscle. By the 8th of August 1945, Marshal Vasylyevsky had successfully organized his forces into three vast army groups, or fronts. Beyond Manchuria's northwestern border, he positioned the Second Far Eastern Front, a combined army group comprising 337,000 men. Their objective, to strike southwest towards the cities of Harbin and Sitsihar. Simultaneously from the northwest, the men of the 36th Combined Arms Army would march forward in support of the same objective. But this 36th Army represented just one element of the wider Trans-Baikal Front, one of the two major army groups on which the success of the offensive would depend. Commanded by Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, another hero of Stalingrad, the Trans-Baikal Front could call on the efforts of 654,000 men once battle was joined at 0100 hours on the 9th of August. And this vast force had a clearly defined objective. The overall plan determined by the Far East Command was for the Trans-Baikal Front to form one half of a classic pincer movement. Its objective was to sweep over the inner Mongolian desert, over the Grand Hingyan Mountains, and down into the strategically vital central Manchurian plains. If the Trans-Baikal Front succeeded, it would be joined there by the men of the First Far Eastern Front, approaching from the opposite side. This second half of the pincer was another vast army group, a total of 587,000 troops, under the command of Marshal Kirill Meretskov. The resources at his disposal included Colonel General Krylov's 5th Combined Arms Army, a force that would be in action as soon as the offensive began. By the 8th of August 1945, Krylov and his troops finally knew when that moment would be. The final great campaign of the Second World War was now imminent. At 0100 hours on the 9th of August 1945, the men of the 5th Combined Arms Army moved across the border. On thousands of miles of front, all around Japanese-occupied territory, the same story was repeated. The Manchuria campaign had begun. When Marshal Vasilievsky and his colleagues considered their strategy for the Manchurian campaign, there was some thought given to the idea of a staggered attack, to advance from the west before engaging the troops on the other side of the country. But in the end, it was those who argued for a simultaneous attack whose opinion prevailed. So the Trans-Baikal Front, the Second Far Eastern Front, and the First Far Eastern Front all attacked together. And if we consider the operations of just one army, we can gain an insight into the thinking behind the Manchurian offensive as a whole. Speed, surprise, flexibility, ingenuity. These were the keys to Soviet success. And the 5th Combined Arms Army of the First Far Eastern Front was just one force to deliver remarkable results. Its commander, Colonel General Krylov, was given a simple objective: to break through the Japanese defences that stretched for 40 kilometres in a line through the town of Swifeno, the headquarters of the 124th Japanese Infantry Division. Krylov's troops had long experience of attacking fortified positions from their engagements in the Königsberg region of East Prussia. So in August 1945, they were given a chance to display their skills once again, 10,000 kilometres away. To the Japanese, it seemed inevitable that any Soviet attack would come through the Swifeno Valley. But Krylov decided to take a less obvious approach. It was typical of the events that took place on the first day of the Manchuria campaign. Defying heavy rain, the Fifth Army's advance parties were instead ordered to move forward through the woody, hilly terrain that lay to the north. At first, the Japanese failed to notice the almost silent companies of infantry and supporting engineers. When the advancing Soviets arrived at the first of the Japanese defensive positions, they were still well protected by the cover of night, and the full reality of the situation now revealed itself to the Japanese forces. At the fortified position codenamed Sharp, the advanced troops of 5th Army's 144th Rifle Regiment launched their attack at 0400 hours. But it was only when they were joined by units of tanks and 152mm self-propelled guns that the Japanese fortification was finally reduced. To the south of the strong point codenamed Camel, the terrain was too marshy for armoured support to be deployed against the Japanese position. But for Captain Shverbakov of the 3rd Battalion, 707th Rifle Regiment, this was not going to prevent an assault by his company using closer combat weapons. Explosives, grenades, and petrol bombs were all brought to bear against the Japanese pillboxes and gun emplacements. the unsettling menace of the flamethrower was also deployed with devastating effect. After just 2 hours of engagement, the Camel stronghold was secured, enabling the main body of Fifth Army troops to advance. And advance they did. By the end of the 9th of August 1945, Fifth Army had forced a 35-kilometre hole in the Japanese defences, as retreating forces attempt to secure a new line west of Mulang, an effort hampered by the Soviet cutting of telephone cables. It was the 11th of August before the Japanese were able to regroup in any sort of order, by which time Fifth Army had advanced 80 kilometres into Manchurian territory. The Japanese had been taken completely by surprise, and the Soviet Fifth Army had exceeded their own expectations. By the 11th of August, advance troops were heading towards the vital city of Mutanqiang, headquarters of the Japanese First Area Army. The plan was to take the city within 18 days. As events transpired, the first Soviet attacks on Mutanqiang took place on day 3. Dramatic Soviet progress was also secured to the north, as General Bieloborodov led a simultaneous attack by his First Red Banner Army. In this sector, the terrain was even more treacherous. Thick forest-covered hills, anything up to 1,000 meters in height. Rain-swollen streams and rivers had turned many valley areas into marshland. And advancing infantry also had to contend with the so-called taiga, a ground covering of thick woody foliage whose sharp needles could rip a soldier's flesh. Combined with heavy rain, the result was a landscape that was surely unsuitable for a fast-moving infantry advance. But the First Red Banner Army leadership took a different view. As elsewhere, Soviet tactics were dominated by the desire for surprise, so General Bieloborodov split his troops into several individual axes of advance, and in the early hours of the 9th of August, single infantry columns began their march into an area with few substantial Japanese positions. The Kwantung Army considered the difficulty of the terrain to be defence enough. But the First Red Banner Army were equal to the challenge, as they used a subtle combination of resources to make substantial progress. In the early hours of the 9th of August, 2 columns of regimental size led the way through the forest, hacking their way through the undergrowth as they went. And these infantrymen were also supported by a detachment of armour. But these T-34 tanks were not deployed for the power of their 85mm guns. Instead, they were used to clear a path through the forest by knocking over any trees that blocked their way. The fallen trees were then gathered together and formed into a roadway by accompanying engineers. Within hours, this so-called corduroy road was 5 meters wide and able to support advancing self-propelled guns and trucks, speeding the Soviet advance still further. Again, surprise and ingenuity proved decisive. By the morning of the 11th of August, First Red Banner Army had secured territory up to the line of the Mulang River, and leading detachments were already heading for the city of Mutanqiang to support their Fifth Army colleagues to the south. All over eastern Manchuria, the Japanese were stunned by the Soviet assault. Earlier in 1945, the Kwantung Army leadership had accepted the need for a defensive strategy in the event of a Soviet attack. The plan was to engage the invaders immediately, before staging an orderly withdrawal to the plains region in the south, while continuing to harry the enemy at every opportunity. The hope was that the Soviet troops would then be tired and vulnerable to a counterattack. It was a realistic strategy, but the sheer speed of the Soviet offensive prevented any kind of coherent response. In the southeast, the Soviet 25th Army swept down towards Japanese northern Korea at breakneck speed, supported by the power of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. As 25th Army moved forward, they found Japanese defences already laid waste by the big guns of their naval colleagues, and their relentless progress continued. After just 2 days